Hi, and welcome back to Psychology with me, Mr. Snyder, and today we're going to start our unit on psychological disorders by discussing what is abnormal behavior. So we'll talk about the historical views of abnormality, talk about what is abnormal behavior, talk about the challenges of diagnosing behavior, the major models of abnormality, and how we classify psychological disorders with the DSM, and how stigma can relate to abnormal behavior. But for now, psychopathology is what we call the study of abnormal behavior and psychological dysfunction. They've been trying to cure mental illness since we know 3000 BCE or BC, for those of you who haven't switched over to the new system yet. They found skulls with holes that were cut into the living person, and this was done in ancient times to release the demons that were inside a victim, and it's called trephining. And it's still done today to relieve pressure of fluids in the brain if that builds up and there's too much pressure on the brain. But back then it was done to release the demons possessing a victim. Hippocrates is a Greek physician, and he has a theory about the biological processes going on that cause our behavior. And it's the first recorded attempt to connect thinking and abnormal behavior. He believed that mental illness is due to the imbalance of four humors that are inside the body: the black bile, yellow bile, blood, and phlegm. In the Middle Ages, they thought that spirit possession and demonic possession, when the person was the victim, is the cause of abnormal behavior. And so they performed exorcisms in order to sort of exonerate or get rid of the demon inside. And during the Renaissance era, they believed that abnormal behavior was seen as the person was a witch and they were called to be put to death. Today, it's viewed from a medical model so that it can be diagnosed according to the various symptoms that a person has, and it has an etiology, a course, and a prognosis. So how do we explain what is abnormal behavior? What is abnormal? Well, in order to determine what is abnormal, we have to consider that what is normal is what most people do. So something that is normal is frequently occurring behavior. That means that something that is abnormal deviates from the norms of society. And it all depends, it can depend on the situational context of this behavior as well, which is the social or environmental setting of a person's behavior. Laughing at a comedy club is perfectly appropriate. Laughing at a funeral during the eulogy, however, probably is not appropriate. So that's an example of situational context. Subjective discomfort. The behavior has to give the person some sort of discomfort, emotional distress when engaging in a particular behavior. All thoughts or behavior that might be considered abnormal might not necessarily create subjective discomfort. For example, the serial killer feels no wrong for what he does, but there are some forms of abnormal behavior that shows the symptoms of it are showing no emotions at all. Finally, this behavior has to become somewhat maladaptive, which means that the person who is suffering from the behavior finds it hard to adapt to the demands of day-to-day living, and then it can be considered a psychological disorder. So what is the problem with diagnosing psychological disorder? It needs to fit at least two of these 5 criteria in order to be termed with a psychological disorder. So is this thinking or behavior abnormal? Is it unusual? Does the thinking or behavior go against social norms? Does the behavior or the psychological function cause that person's subjective discomfort? Is this thought process maladaptive, or does it result in the person's inability to function in day-to-day life? And does the thought process or behavior cause danger to themselves or others? If we can consider 2 of those to a person's behavior, then we can start to diagnose them with a psychological disorder, which is any pattern of behavior or thinking that causes people significant distress, causes them to harm others or harms their ability to function in everyday life. And just a point of clarification that abnormality is different from being insane. Insane and insanity is a legal term, at least in the United States, to argue that the mentally ill person who commits a crime did not know what they were doing at the time and could not tell the difference between right or wrong, which is known as the insanity defense. And it's very, very rare that the insanity defense ever goes through, but it still is played every now and again in the courtroom, and you need psychologists to come in and testify, and it can become a very lengthy process and difficult to prove that the person was insane at the time of the crime. So let's look at the different models of abnormality. Each perspective of psychology has an idea of how abnormal behavior works. First off, we have the biological model, which is explaining the behavior as biological changes in the chemical, structural, or genetic systems of the body. And basically, this means that psychological disorders have a biological or medical cause. And this can explain disorders such as anxiety, depression, or schizophrenia as an imbalance or faulty neurotransmitters systems, genetic problems, brain damage, and dysfunction. And then we have the psychological models, which would be thinking, and the theories of personality can be used to describe and explain the formation of this personality, but also quirks in the personality or disordered thinking behavior and abnormal personalities. The psychodynamic view would say that we're trying to repress one's threatening thoughts, and that is causing abnormal behavior from the conscious mind. Behaviorism would say that the behavior is just a set of learned responses. Since behaviorism can explain regular behavior, it can also be used to explain disordered behavior. It's just a set of learned responses. The person learned their cognitive or their psychological disorder. A cognitive psychologist would say that people think, remember, and mentally organize information illogically, and these patterns are messed up. And if we can clear up these patterns, then it would be the person would function just fine. And then we can look at the sociocultural perspective, saying that any sort of behavior, abnormal versus normal behavior, is the product of behavioral shaping within the context of the family influences, the social group that the person is in, and the culture that they exist. And then finally, we have the biopsychosocial perspective, which basically says, hey, it's everything. It's biological, it's psychological, and it's sociocultural, and this causes psychological disorders. How do we classify psychological disorders? We do it with the DSM-5, or the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. It's been published since 1952. We're currently on the 5th edition. It is the most used resource in the United States. It helps psychologists, insurance companies, doctors diagnose psychological disorder. It lists around 250 different disorders, symptoms, courses of those disorders in 20 different categories. The DSM-5, like I said, is the current edition. It was released in 2013. It combines all of these disorders into a single list. They used to have a multi-axis system, but now it's just a single list of disorders. What is the prevalence of psychological disorders? How common are they? I mean, you might be surprised to find out that it's quite common for someone to have a mental disorder or to suffer from more than one mental disorder at a time. So in any given year, at any given time, about 26.2% of Americans, adults that are 18 years of age or older, suffer from a mental disorder. Only about 5.8% of the U.S. population suffer from a severe mental disorder like schizophrenia or anything like that. They are the leading cause of disability in the United States and Canada. So here's just a look at some different psychological disorders in the United States. Like 9.5% of U.S. population suffer from bipolar and depressive disorders. Let's see, social anxiety disorder is 6.8 of the American percent of the American population. Generalized anxiety disorder is 3.1%. Obsessive compulsive disorder is 1%. Schizophrenia is 1.1% of the American population suffers. And we're talking in the millions of people are affected by these diseases. So they are something that need to be studied and dealt with and talked about. Stigma of these disorders can also be a good or a bad thing. Labels, although they can be very helpful, they can also be misleading. So depression, anxiety, and schizophrenia, we all have stigma or feelings that we feel when it comes to those disorders. It allows psychological professionals to communicate with each other about people and their symptoms and their disorders. It helps patients receive effective treatment. It establishes distinct diagnostic categories that we all understand and recognize so we know what is wrong with people. But David Rosenhan did a study in 1972, 1973 where he proved the danger of labels and the stigma that goes with it. So 8 volunteers, and himself and 7 other volunteers, so 8 people total, went and claimed to hear voices. And so they applied for admission to a mental hospital, and 7 of the 8 received a diagnosis of schizophrenia, because that's a main symptom of schizophrenia is hearing voices. They had no other symptoms beyond hearing voices. Once admitted to the hospital, they just acted like normal people. They were walking around, talking to people. They never pretended to be mentally ill except for hearing voices, and they did flush their medication down the toilet, so they didn't end up taking the medication. Doctors interpreted their normal behavior as abnormal behavior. One person was taking notes over what was going on, and that was considered abnormal. It was really interesting that the other patients were the ones that were more likely to suspect that these people weren't ill. They actually thought they were investigative journalists pretending to get on the inside of the hospital, but they noticed that they weren't ill before the staff. So the summary of this study is that psychological labels are very powerful and long-lasting, and they come with a stigma attached to it. So we need to be careful not to go just by the label and remember that there's an actual person behind it. That's all I have for you today. Next time we're going to get into the specific disorders that we talk about. And once we get there, I will see you then. Have a good night. Bye-bye.